Hello and welcome. Today's video will cover the disassembly, diagnosis, and repair of the H.A.R.V. Depending on what's wrong with the gearbox, there are multiple ways of repairing it, some easy and some are harder. This gearbox employs an external S gear with driver gear on the main axle, with an S gear and main gear on the inside of the gearbox. Once you get a rhythm of how to repair this particular vehicle, you fall into a rhythm and it becomes easier as you go through each vehicle. That is, if you have multiple of them. As you can see here, I already have multiple gearboxes ready for whatever problem this particular toy has. Here I'm testing out the way the mechanism works as it's lifting this rail gunner onto the bed of the truck. At times you can hear the gearbox engage, and if sometimes you don't hear it at all, it could be multiple things. If you can hear the gearbox engage a little bit, it means that the external S-spring and driver gear are no longer functioning properly. By turning the vehicle on its side, you have access to the 5 screws underneath. It's best to begin unscrewing from the front of the vehicle and work your way back, since the 2 last screws hold together a spring that's connected to the linkage of the action button. Once you have those screws removed, hold the toy in your hand firmly and place it on the table for disassembly. Once you remove the top half of the vehicle, you can see the assembly that holds the gearbox, the button or action button with spring and assembly, and you can also see the counter lever and stabilizer release. Here you can see the spring that helps with the stabilizing foot to come down. That's the counter lever that releases it. And underneath you can see where the housing comes out. There's a tab there that notches into the rear end of the vehicle. Also, you can see where the gearbox is, and there is only one screw that you undo to remove the assembly. First off, you should remove the stabilizer from the assembly, as seen here. Incidentally, these springs on this particular assembly are the same exact springs that are used on the wind-up toys that hop. Inside, you'll find this exact spring, just in case you don't have it. As you can see here, as I move the lifting arm from the toy backwards and forwards, you can see the counter lever move to expose the screw underneath. Remove that screw and remove the other one at the other end of the assembly. The assembly will now split in half, and you can rotate one half out of the way to access the gears inside. Removing the large gear in the center will release the gearbox from the housing. Simply place the damaged gearbox aside, and in this case, I've already prepped another gearbox that's ready to go. So I simply do the disassembly process in reverse and reassemble the toy. What works for me on reassembly is to attach the stabilizer first, and then simultaneously, as you're installing it back into the toy, guide in the stabilizer before the assembly. It's going to give you a little trouble for some reason. I didn't figure that part out, but you might have to try multiple times to get it right. In addition, there are two springs on either arm of the lifting mechanism which fit into grooves. The little springs can be seen when you turn over the assembly with the arms. The springs are exposed underneath. Try to fit those springs into the slot at the same time as you reinstall the assembly back into the toy. Once you're satisfied and you have everything in place, go ahead and put back the one and only screw that holds the assembly down. Now we can go ahead and test the lifting arm and see if it deploys properly. After testing out the toy, replace the action button with spring and assembly, and then place back the top half of the toy. moving away the lifting arms, push down on the rear of the top half of the toy and hold it in your hand firmly. Now place the toy on its side and begin replacing the screws starting from the rear. Okay, this toy is now repaired. Before we begin to move on to the next one, we have to figure out what's wrong with the gearbox. That way, when we open the next toy, we are able to just replace the gearbox and reassemble the toy quickly. Now we're going to diagnose the gearbox we just removed from the last toy. Taking some needle nose pliers, grab the clamp that's installed on the axle outside of the gearbox, and you would probably hear immediately if the S-spring inside is engaging. It looks like it is. So then we move ourselves to the outside S-spring, and it's not working. The gearbox moves freely. This would happen to be an easy fix. Simply remove the clamp with some snips, remove the gears with S-spring, and begin the process of gluing the gear onto the axle. So what I usually do at this point is I take a file or sandpaper and I scratch the outside axle before gluing the gears to it. That way it adheres better to that axle. Now, I should also tell you, these gearboxes are over 30 years old. So the plastic has degraded enough that the gearbox is kind of flimsy. And while you're rubbing the axle with your file or sandpaper, it may come apart. So be aware. After testing the gearbox and making sure it's running okay, I'm going to go ahead and place glue on this axle or main axle. Now, this main axle has a clamp at the other end close to the gearbox. So you can go ahead and put that main gear all the way up towards that clamp. And then, just as an added piece of assurance there, I'm going to go ahead and glue that S gear onto that driver gear, just for stability. Now that we've glued these pieces onto the gearbox, we'll go ahead and put it aside and clean up our workspace and get ready to disassemble the next toy. Now, I must tell you that this particular setup on this gearbox from this toy resembles a lot the elevator platform from the Starcom H.A.R.V base that I worked on the last, I think it was the third video I did. And the gearbox setup is very similar. Okay, this toy is done. Let's move on to the gearbox and see what's wrong with it. Here I'm going to go ahead and grab the driver gear and S-spring, and it looks like it's not grabbing. It's got to be that one. But to make sure, I'm going to go ahead and take my needle nose pliers and grab the clamp on the outside and turn the motor. It sounds like it's engaging. Yeah. It's the outside driver gear with S-spring. If you can see here, you can see a slight fracture of that S-spring gear. That's why it's not working. Let's go ahead and take this clamp off with the snips and just glue it directly to the axle. So this particular gearbox has the same problem as the gearbox from the last toy. It's going to be fairly simple to repair. Here's another gearbox that I'm going to inspect too. Now, this outside S-spring looks like it doesn't engage. But then when I put the needle nose pliers on the clamp, the S-spring inside the gearbox doesn't engage either. So it looks like that's going to be a full rebuild. Okay, so after scratching up the axle, make sure you put a fair amount of glue on that axle. Place the driver gear upon it with a slow twisting motion. Work your way down the axle towards the clamp and let it rest there. Then apply some glue to the end tip of the axle and apply that spring or S-spring gear onto it, just to make sure it doesn't come off. Now we have another gearbox ready to be assembled. Or installed, I should say. Now, for this gearbox, I'm going to have to do a full rebuild. So I've already replaced this gearbox, the black one, with a new ratcheting S-spring with main gear. And it's ready to go. All I have to do is remove the outer driver gear with S-spring from the old gearbox and install it on the new one. Since it's prepped, we'll just go ahead and do that. What I'm doing here is I'm comparing the axles to see how much of the new axle I have to cut off. Remember when I told you that these gearboxes are 30 years old and to be careful? Yeah.
Oops.
That's what happens. But this is a good opportunity to show you how to reassemble the gearbox in case the outside driver gear and S-spring are still good. I'll show you how to reassemble this gearbox in reverse. That way you don't have to cut off something that's actually working, which is the outside driver gear and S-spring. Just let me find all the pieces and I'll be right back. Now, for this instance, you have to use your imagination for a little bit. Just imagine at the other end of this axle, there is a driver gear and an S-spring gear that are still intact. And what you would have to do is put the outer spring housing onto the axle and then install the spring behind it. After that, you'll have to push fit the S-spring gear, making sure it engages onto the spring itself as you're installing it. What I'm doing here is I'm doing that, but with, of course, the S-spring gear already installed onto the main axle, or the axle. Now that I have it in place, I make sure that the spring is going through the two little forks on the side of the housing. And just get my big head out of the way. Wow. Really? Okay. And there you go. That's how it has to look when you're going to install it in that way. Now we assemble the gears, placing the main gear and then gear 2, that is gear 3, gear 1, oh, I did that in reverse, sorry, should be gear 1 after you put in gear 2. I'm going to use these tweezers my wife got me. Should have done this a long time ago using these tweezers. This is nice. And then we'll do the caging gear. Okay, similar to the way we always do it to rebuild a gearbox, the top half is already assembled. All we have to do is be careful merging them together. And there you have it. This way, you can keep the outside gear and S-spring gear on the original axle if it still functions correctly. Of course, you would have to modify the main gear inside the gearbox like I've shown you before by using a T5 star bit and working your way up to a T6, since the original axle is a little thicker than the new one. But let's get back to gluing the gears onto this gearbox. Okay, so this toy is good to go. Now, once you pick up a rhythm, you can do multiple toys and get them finished quickly. Here I have several of them finished. And if you can hear, you would probably be able to tell which one has an original S-spring gear and which one has the new ratcheting S-spring gear. So this will be the final toy that needs repairing. This toy lacks a lot of items that the other toys have. A magnet for one, and a stabilizer for the rear. I'm going to go ahead and install this newly fixed gearbox, and then I'm going to show you a problem that I ran into and how I solved it. This was unique to only this toy. This toy was also the first toy I started to disassemble and remove the gearbox from. Since it lacked a lot of things, I wanted to see what I was dealing with. Since this was the first toy I worked on, it doesn't have a gearbox. So I'll simply replace it and close up the toy. But there's something wrong. I can't get it in there. I think it's what's left protruding out of the side of the gearbox is the spring. It's a new one and it bends differently, so I'll have to flatten it out. In addition, this is why I can't swap out these gearboxes with a new one, since the tolerances are very tight. With a little bit more coaxing, I was able to get the gearbox into place. Now I've replaced the middle gear, and now I'll close up the assembly. Okay, ready. Let's begin assembly. Placing the assembly back into the toy, I don't have a rear stabilizer to put in first before it. So I'll simply just put it in. And also, I have to acquire a magnet from somewhere. As you can see, the toy doesn't fully deploy. The arms don't have enough strength to reach the end of where they're supposed to be. This is a first for this type of vehicle that I've been fixing. I have to make some adjustments to the gearbox. If I slightly take out the gearbox from the side of the assembly, I'm able to freely move the whole assembly back, and hopefully that'll be able to give enough torque to the arms so they can complete a cycle. This is the first time I've had to make this adjustment. So the clicking you hear is the gears skipping. So you have to place your finger on top of the gearbox and push it into place, keeping it there as you wind up the gearbox, and then place it inside the toy. Hopefully that'll give it enough torque, I guess, for it to complete a cycle. Okay, this toy has been repaired. Repairing these H.A.R.V. 7s, or H.A.R.V. 7s I should say, was fun and very interesting to learn from. I hope you liked the video, and remember to like and subscribe. See you on the next video, and thanks for watching.